Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, there we go. Can you please take your seats for the rest of the performing circus? So, I forgot to say something in my extemporary remarks of thanks to Dan earlier on, which is this, that stamp clubs and societies are folding at an unprecedented rate. And I expect if we went round the room here, we could come across half a dozen societies which are close to folding. One of the things the Royal does is it collects their records. And we have some really quite interesting, we have the records of the Brighton Society, one of the earlier Brighton societies, there were 3 Brighton societies, we've got the records of one of them. We've got the records of the Hearts Philatelic Society, which was a very significant society in the early days, and a lot of others. So not just societies and specialist societies, whose libraries are also coming to us, but federations, organizations that run regional exhibitions and so on. And we are very keen to stop these falling into the paper recycling chain. So if any of you are ever close to a society which is considering closure, can you just grab hold of their records and stop them going anywhere else except here? Because at least here they might not get looked at for a long time, but they will still be here and the source of a lot of future research, I hope, because you get these splendid lists of those who attended the meetings, and you can put together these lists of society and club members with a little patience and a lot of time. So I forgot to say that, and that's the first thing. The second thing is I need to introduce David Beech. Well, truly, I don't really need to introduce David Beech because we've seen him before. But David, and he never writes this in his little blurbs, David is pretty much wholly responsible for the preservation of the Crawford Philatelic Literature Collection at the British Library. And that's an extraordinary achievement over 30 years. And I think one of the finest things that has been done to preserve the history of our past. So thank you, David. David's also an author, and here we have a bibliography of the philatelic writings, etc., of David Beech from 1970. I can't say it's riveting reading, but it is interesting reading, and the range of subjects that David has studied is quite remarkable. So after 30 years, after being at Harmer's, the auctioneer, after 30 years of the British Library, after being president of the society here, and he's been honoured by the Philatelic Achievement Award by the National Postal Museum, and currently a member of the Advisory Council for the British Library Collections Trust. David's contribution to philately over many years is significant, and I'm grateful that he's agreed to speak today. And you'll see him again next year. I'm afraid David's likely to be the feature speaker because he covers so much territory at Crawford festivals for some time to come. David, thank you very much for talking to us, and thank you very much for being here today again. Thank you.
Plus, the article that first materialised some years ago has been reproduced. What I'm going to say is largely based on this, and I'm going to go through this from some speaking notes so you can see various points and pick on them. Otherwise, I just read these notes out, and I don't think quite so boring as that. Giving a presentation about periodicals or journals, I thought I'd ask the audience and see that the microphones are there ready, because I think that this session is best dealt with by being somewhat interactive with the audience. So we'll probably, to some extent, take questions as we go, and I've got permission to do that. So I'd like to ask you, please, to give your definition of what a journal or a periodical is. Because there's a meaning to the word journal or periodical, or in modern terms serial in library talk. So who's got a definition of what a journal is? Hands up. Oh gosh. So you've come along to an event where you don't know what we're talking about.
Just a moment, Daphne.
I would say that a journal is a day-by-day account of what happens.
Right. Grace has got a point.
On my way, Grace. Here you are.
Just to put in the melting pot, I would say it's a magazine relating to a specific subject or area.
Right.
I think it's something that comes on my telephone every morning, marked T.
Right.
A journal. I would think it should be a peer-reviewed publication, so one expects the articles to have travelled somewhat between people who know about the subject and verified it in some way.
Right. Verified, a very current word with the BBC. Any other guesses, suggestions, authoritative answers?
Something that is designed to be published on more than one occasion, a regular or irregular publication about a variety of subjects, but which is seen to have a longer life. Though having said that, this morning's talk suggested it didn't always work, but that I suspect is that I would say is the idea behind an ongoing periodic publication.
Right. Anyone else?
Roger?
It seems to me one of the functions is a journal of record. So it's actually a record of the research. And in that sense, it has to have a continuity.
Sun newspaper is a periodical. Any other? Okay. Well, the last two speakers have got to the nub of it. It's a core question for any conference or proceedings about journals. A journal is a publication that comes out at periods where from volume 1, number 1, or number 1, the intention is to publish it forever. The intention is to publish it forever. So in 1892, the London Philatelic, published by the Philatelic Society of London, appeared, and it's still going today. So a periodical can be volume 1, number 1. That's the only one that ever appeared. It's a periodical. So there's, in fact, two types of publication that exist in library speak, and those are monographs, which are printed books, printed as opposed to manuscript originally, now printed as opposed to manuscript and digital. So everything can be divided into the two. So auction catalogues are periodicals. Libraries these days talk of them as serials, which means the same as periodical. So journals tend to be society publications, which is where we feed back into the questions of record. But newspapers are periodicals, and some newspapers are worth reading and some might not be. So there's no judgment on the content, I think. Now, I'm really covering two subjects which roll into one. That is writing for and using periodicals for research. And I'm largely following the text which is in the handout today of my article. And when it comes to research for writing for periodicals, of course, one is not restricted in any way by any medium you use. So you certainly will use journals, which is the most challenging method, but one would be using monographs, printed books, internet, and anything else that may appear, manuscripts, for example, government records, etc. But I often feel that people in writing for anything rather tend to, especially if it's for record, rush into print. Whereas if you're writing for record, these things need to take much longer and to be much better considered. Consideration is called scholarship and interpretation. But the great challenge in any kind of philatelic research is actually to find the texts. Now, with books, it tends to be much easier because books tend to be kept, they're understood as one-offs. You can get books in lots of volumes, especially in Germany, they will publish 10-volume work on something. It's not a periodical because once the 10th volume has appeared, it finishes. So in finding information in periodicals, one's got a rather large challenge. I think it is going to get easier as time goes along with digitization. But whatever you write, and whatever you write as an article, or you write as a book, whatever you do, if you want your book, your article to be found, computer age, must give it a title that's got the key words. If you haven't got the key words in, someone might do a research on, a computer search on lots of things, but you might not find it. Now, there's a book published in New Zealand that's called Of Cowrie and Gold. Now, if you've read my article, which has now appeared in French, German, Dutch, as well as my sort of English, you'll see that I mention this. But what do you think a book called Of Cowrie and Gold is actually about? Anyone going to have a guess? Okay, we've got money, we've got trade, history of discovery. No one's got it yet. Seashells, yes. Okay, so this book, which is actually about the philately of the Coromandel Peninsula of New Zealand from 1750 to 1973, you're not going to find. So what does actually cowrie and gold mean? So what's cowrie? Anyone know what cowrie is? No, it's a tree in New Zealand, a kauri tree. And they take 1,000 years to grow, and the Maoris and the Europeans chop them down, so they're quite rare in New Zealand. In Wellington, there's the world's largest, second largest wooden building made of kauri trees. And gold? Now, if you said gold, what would you think? Now, this is all an illustration in the mindset of researching, because you're given some clues here and you've got to find out what it is. Now, the authors of this book are not making it very easy, are they? Now, gold is gold mining. Most of that in postal period took place in the 1860s, and near the Thames, near the town of Thames in the North Island of New Zealand, a lot of gold found. There were lots of kauri trees, so they were cutting down the kauri trees to get at the gold, potting up shafts and mines and so on. So, the title of your book about the postal history of the Coromandel Peninsula as kauri and gold, you're not going to find on an internet search. So immediately you're obscuring You're obscuring the book you're trying to promote. This also occurs with periodicals, and I'm going to tease a couple of people in the audience, because if you've got a periodical, call it, and it's a country study, put the name of the country into your title. So the Upland Goose, for example, I can see two people are laughing there, but doesn't actually mean anything unless you've been to Falkland Islands. I've eaten an upland goose, and jolly yummy it is too. But unless you know that, would you, if you were researching Falklands philately, think about looking in a periodical called Upland Goose? Now, if you've been there, there's millions of the things. The same, of course, applies to maple leaves. There's others. Maple leaves is Canada, but unless you know that, so don't put up barriers to what you do. Make it easy for people to find, and it's so much more important now about computer searches. Now, in doing any kind of research, for an article, for a journal, the first thing that one has to do is to think about what sort of journal it is. Now, we've heard mention of journals of record. There are journals that might be commercial or perhaps are rather ephemeral. So you've got to think about the level at which you're going to pitch all of this. So if you're writing something, say, for the London Philatelist, it really ought to come up to a very high standard. And you've got to make it serious. And you've got to start off, if it's any good, to set the context right. Where was this place? What was going on? Who was involved? Otherwise, if you go into detail, and you'll see in my piece in the handout, Context Philately, I go into one particular presentation given to this society about the postmarks of Aden. And the splendid presentation and collection we were shown went straight into the first type of the postmarks of Aden. It didn't tell you where Aden was. It didn't tell you why it was run by India to start with, and then the British. It didn't say what the politics were. It didn't tell you anything about the place. So immediately going in to look at the first type of postmarks of Aden might be very interesting, but it's never going to encourage other people to actually come forward and be interested in this subject. Setting things in context makes all the difference. So if you're writing, think about who your audience is. Not just the type of journal it is, but when you write for all time. Don't just write in philately because it's currently interesting. I mean, as Dan has pointed out, largely marketing of stamp dealing, of collectors. We've seen that, and that is now being studied today. So what you write should stand the test of time. So in doing that, one's also got to think about not using terms that won't be understood in, say, 50 years' time. And there's lots of things that people will use as shorthands in discussion. But if you're writing for all time, then you've got to try and time-proof your remarks as best you can. Now, it's why I always, perhaps it makes it a bit dull, but in journals of record, you have to perhaps label the point by mentioning what it is exactly you mean. Because if you're not going to time-proof it, what will this actually mean? And it will cause a researcher to go into sorts of websites and things to work out what this word actually meant. Now, we've had an example of that this morning, Kauri. Now, no one thought it was a tree. Is it a shell? Is it spelt the same way? Has the spelling varied? So you've got to be very careful in what you're writing to make it time-proof. Not easy. Have a jolly good go. Now, the first thing to do in any philatelic research, in my view, is to research the literature. Everything else really is a waste of time because you need to see the context in which the research has got to. some subjects are new and almost nothing has been written. And if you research the literature, if the literature is any good, it will have a bibliography, have references, which points you to further literature. So I'm a great believer in having references for everything to prove the fact. Because otherwise, people can go along making it up. And in some of the lesser journals of record, one finds that people make it up, and especially they repeat old stories that have gone on before. One thinks of Mauritius 1847 post office issue where someone put around that the engraver Joseph Barnard had forgotten what to engrave on the side of the stamps. He passed the post office, saw the words post office and said, yes, I'll put post office on. That's complete fabrication. Has largely been debunked by lots of people, particularly Norman Williams, and I've had a go. But even recently, that story has appeared. So all sorts of things like that really ought to be scotched if you can. So it's important to look for the literature, and that often takes a long time. So if we're doing anything which is serious and for the record, never rush into writing something for the sake of it. Now, during my years at the British Library, I had lots and lots of research projects, and I would just put things into folders and keep them, and in retirement I'm gradually researching these and publishing them. It's proved a wonderful thing to do in retirement. And what I do, I'll move on a bit and we'll come back to the research techniques, but what I do in writing for a periodical is in fact to have a folder full of information which one keeps and looks at and reviews while one's tracking down the material, which is difficult. And this is a technique I found quite useful. You might like to follow it or modify it as you please, but I give each project a number. And my numbering system is PA, which stands for Philatelic Article, and then a number, and then a rough description. Just a couple of words so I can find it in a document. And every bit of email correspondence I have has that number attached to it, and I file it all under a numbered system, so that when I come to do the research and finish it off into an article, I can find everything. At least that's what I like to say. But the thing that I also do is to create a Word document, and I put the number at the top of the Word document, and I have a working title, which may change in due course. And then I start off with notes, and these are things I need to check, ideas, notions, the product of a conversation with someone about it, must check so-and-so, must think of this angle. I write all this down, otherwise where does it go? It needs to be kept. Then for larger projects, and I'm still hoping to write an improved version of the history of the Shanahan Auction Company, I'll start a timeline. My timeline for Shanahan's auctions starts in 1910 and finishes with the birth of one of the people involved, finishes in 2010 with the last death of the members of the Shanahan family. And all of the events in between are clocked up. And this allows you very clearly to clear the mind of the fog of research, if you like. One can see when it happened, in which order it happened, so you can understand why certain things happen certain times. I think that's quite a good technique. You haven't got to necessarily publish that in your article, but it does marshal your thoughts, and you can use it to make sure, if you've been working on that for some time, you don't miss anything out that needs to be said. I also have a section called People. So if we take Shanahan stamp auctions, there were lots and lots of people involved. Shanahans themselves, Paul Singer, members of the Irish government, the Doyle, the Taoiseach, when questions were asked in Parliament. There were several court cases. The judges, the barristers, liquidators are all there. Their full names, their dates of birth, or you've got to work that out. That's in the notes. That's a pending piece of information. And therefore, you don't miss anyone else out. you've already done that essential piece of research in finding who was involved, what was their part in it. Don't lose track of things. Every work really ought to have some kind of select bibliography to take people on to the next stage. Select is a word that means effectively it's not complete. Complete bibliography is something extremely difficult to do because of the difficulty in finding things. References are key. Anything that can't be demonstrated with the reference is a guess or an old wives' tale or something that might be untrue. It's perfectly valid in a finished article to talk about it is suggested that, because if there is no answer and something's occurred, you've got to think about what might have happened. But if you do that, you've got to think of all the possibilities of what might have happened. It's a bit like Sherlock Holmes saying, well, there's 10 possibilities, 4 of them are impossible, so now, no matter how impossible it is, the 5th one must be right. And you'll probably remember that from reading Sherlock Holmes, but that's also a particularly good principle. You need to think widely, don't need to rule anything out, and you need to approach every project you do with an open mind. Don't discount other people's views just because you don't think fly. Acknowledgements are key. Nobody has ever written an article or a book without someone else helping. If they haven't helped, then the author has made a fundamental mistake in not showing the text and discussing it with other people. Because you can write something, you can be too close to it, might have got the wrong end of the stick and not realised it. You always need to discuss things with third parties, and that's the way you get the best project, whether it be a book or an article. And acknowledging is one of the ways in books and articles that I judge the quality of the book. Because if it's an article and there's no acknowledgement, you just think, well, how good is this piece? How many people have been consulted? But if people have helped, then you should say thank you. And it costs nothing except for a line in an article, a line in a book, to actually say thank you. And that's well worth doing. And if you've consulted with particularly good people in research, one thinks historically of Edward Denny Bacon, if he's written something and said something, you may count on it. The man was incredibly accurate. He was there at the time for postage stamp philately. And therefore, anything he's written, for example, or he's commented upon, will have real quality to it. If you're writing a book, I'm well known for saying, some people disagree because they've broken my rule, is all books need an index. No book is constructed in a way where you find the information out precisely. In my article on about philatelic research, I referred to a book published by someone who was essentially starting off with the early postal history, then going through the stamps chronologically. And he didn't have an index, and if someone I knew rather well, and I said, but you haven't got an index. And he said, well, it's arranged chronologically. My reply was, well, what if you want to know about a particular printer or designer? You mean to say I've got to read the whole book to find out where that printer is mentioned? What's wrong with an index? So it's about making it user-friendly, because once again, whatever you write, in whatever medium it is, you are writing for the user. Always write for the user and for all time. In that way, I think you're going to get a better project. Now, in my page of a Word document where I list this sort of thing, it's particularly important to keep a list of these things, especially acknowledgements. Someone will have a conversation with, and I'll go home and I'll write their name on the acknowledgements page. It costs nothing, everyone likes it. Along the way, if there's something that I've sort of not quite sure about, then I will highlight that in yellow. This has got to be checked. We've got someone's dates and there's conflicting dates as to when they lived, for example. Therefore, you need to do some more work. So I highlight those sorts of things in yellow. And eventually, once I've got all this to a more advanced stage, then I start writing the text, and I will use all this information in this Word document to cut and paste, for instance, in the bibliography. Might need ordering or reordering in some way. So that's how I go about it. But let's get back to the finding of information, because monographs, books, are relatively easy to find in bibliographies and library catalogues, which perform much the same sort of function. But periodicals, and you've now got a good definition of periodicals, are much, much more difficult. Now, specialist periodicals, for example, if you were researching Falkland Islands, you'd look in the Upland Goose, you'd work out what Upland Goose meant, and you would look there. You would look in all the leading research journals, the Collectors Club Flat List, the London Flat List, the Flat List, published by Robson Organisation, etc. And you'd probably find most of this sort of stuff. But then you delve further, and you find how difficult it is to get into periodicals, journals. Now, I can speak from experience, because this book is a bibliography of the Philatelic of New Zealand. It took the three compilers more than 16 years to put together. And this doesn't include articles. This is just monographs, manuscripts, stamp catalogues, auction catalogues, periodicals. So if you just take New Zealand, a place that's never had more than 3, 4, 5 million people in it, the periodicals section is on 13 pages, and those 13 pages just list the titles and bare bones details of when they were published. That's 13 pages just for New Zealand Philatelic. And New Zealand Philatelic has a particularly strong literature, very strong, one of the strongest countries in the world given its size. So if you're delving into this sort of thing, this isn't easy. So if you're writing to be serious, don't rush into it. Now this doesn't include any indexing of any periodical. It includes indexes. But this sort of volume, if you're writing in New Zealand, if you collect New Zealand, you need this book. Anyone collect New Zealand? Well, you're all playing safe. It's all right, I'll give you a copy because I've got the remainders, of course. But the trouble with this sort of work is that it's not really appreciated. I don't say that because I've still got the remainders, as you can spend a long time providing what I would call the very core of philatelic research, in other words, researching the literature, and they'll ignore it. And the point is, you've got to find the literature to study the subject. You've got to know what was written first and where they got the misapprehension. You've got to see where someone was making it up and got it wrong. You can see where someone originally got that myth story, like the Post Office Mauritius story, that gets repeated on and on and on, because people don't do their research properly. So if you're going to start looking off at books, well, that's relatively easy. You need the equivalent of this book for the country or territory or subject you're studying. And then you've got to spend a lot of time going through periodicals, and that's why philatelic libraries and around the world, especially here, that made a concerted effort under Ron Butler's librarianship, collect and bind periodicals are so important. Now, there are one or two shortcuts. For example, from 1950, the National Philatelic Society started its index of philatelic periodicals, articles, which continued for many years under the late Arthur Brown's good work. And in 1963, they put it all together and published a volume. A rare volume, there's one here, there's one at the British Library, and in a few other places. But there's no market for these things, but they're so essential. Now, this is obviously arranged by subject, and therefore you could go to there and you could be pretty sure that for the periodicals covered, you're going to find the article you want. So that's enormously valuable. Then you've got things like the Bacon Index, Edward Denny Bacon. It's always important to give dates, so it's 1860, 1938. Put together an index of periodical articles, and it's available on the Royal's website. As an aside, there are 3 copies of this in printed form put together by Brian Birch, and the trouble is with a website is you can put your keywords in and you get the answer, but you've got no idea of the magnitude of the whole work. So the 3 copies of the Bacon Index exist. There's one here, there's one at Mail Department at British Library, and there's one with Ian Crane's estate. I'm not quite sure where that is now. And Brian Birch has got that copy. But the whole book is like this, and it's A4 size. And when you actually handle and hold the book and feel it, you can see just how much work went into this. And these things are incredibly valuable. We've also got works like the Harris Index. Who's heard of the Harris Index? Right, okay, the sort of people I would have expected to have heard of that, which is a listing of periodical articles undertaken by Albert H. Harris, republished by H.H. Sales in more recent years. That's an excellent example. They don't entirely use the right titles, and they refer, unfortunately, to whole numbers of the periodical rather than to volumes, page numbers. So one has to work out which whole number it was. So that was a major effect in the work. And then another excellent source of information is the American Philatelic Research Library, where with its David Strait index, under the excellent management of the late Ginny Horn, cataloguing was not only undertaken for printed books, but it, to some extent, they subject indexed printed book. There's a whole line of information it covers: postal history, postal stationery, that sort of thing, that's way beyond any cataloguing standard. The Anglo-American cataloguing rules don't provide for that. So they added that tremendous extra value, which, if you use the database properly, will get you to many of the answers. There's also a great deal of indexing of articles to some extent. It's rather hit and miss, but the task is absolutely enormous. Task of indexing periodicals brought home to me when I was on the council of the National Philatelic Society, and we had this wonderful indexing project, and we had an excellent multi-language, and that's the other problem, languages, of course, chap called John Goss, and he was getting further and further behind with the great explosion of society publications that were out. And we had to grapple with how we were going to cope with this, because he wanted to give it up, and we needed a whole team of people to do it. In the end, we decided that this was impossible to do. We couldn't find enough volunteers. We couldn't find them with the language skills. So the project scaled back to just the British press or popular press. So finding those key articles you need is the most difficult thing in philatelic research. You just have to keep at it, start talking to people like Nicola Davis and me and the successors at the British Library and at APRL and Smithsonian to ask their advice as to how to proceed. So you're after a project. The first thing, whatever you do, is to define your subject. Think about what it is, write it down, think of its parameters. Has it got a date range? Is it postage stamps? Is it postage dues? Is it postal history? Of what? Of where? Which were the territories involved? Have a clear idea of what you're doing. Now, that may need to slightly shift if you find an archive of goodies that is close to what you're doing but beyond it. But perhaps you should think of that as a separate project. I'm just looking at my notes to see what I've flagged up here to mention. So you've checked the literature. I've mentioned a number of the places you should go to. The Global Philatelic Library is particularly important. What they're doing at the American Philatelic Research Library is particularly important. don't expect everything to be digitised. 20 years ago, people were coming to me at the British Library thinking everything was digitised. Well, with 150 million objects, you know, just turning the pages was the difficult thing. So when it came, for example, to the partial digitisation of the Crawford Library, which is 4,500 volumes, actually the great work was done and the time-consuming work was done when it was microfilmed, from which the digital copies were made, just physically turning the pages for the camera. Once you've done it once, you've done it. But that's the key element and the expensive element, in fact, in producing those sorts of things. Just looking through my notes, I've mentioned the upland goose and maple leaves. I mentioned bibliographies. Then if you're interested in some background, you need to look at a little bit of wider reading. You need to think about the sort of context you want to set it in, your article in or your book in. It depends on the subject and the treatment that it requires. And as ever, if you're writing for the reader, who is the audience? So if you're doing something where nothing much has been written and what you're writing has a particular focus, you need to focus on that context to bring out the facts in some logical meaning so that whoever is reading it understands it. And in all of the printed books and articles that are written, everyone, for the benefit of the article itself and for further research, really does need to include bibliographies, references. Because if you find something that's particularly good, it's full of references and a bibliography, then that's going to take you on to the next stage. It's your shortcut. So if you're interested in philately, what it can do, you must include references to other things to help people take the project onto a next stage. Now, talking of the next stage, one has to be realistic about what you can achieve in an article, say in the London Philatelist. Journals of record are often places where someone will write something and they've done as much research as they can and their scholarship kicks in and they set it into context. And then you find that someone comes along 20 years later with another view of something. It's only by the use of articles across the period of time do we actually get to an understanding of the truth that might turn out to be the handbook on the subject. So in periodicals, it's often a question of work in progress. Now, there was a very good example recently in the London Philatelist where an excellent piece of research about the Spain 1851 Two Reales Error of Colour was published in the Spanish language, and Richard Garcia in Gibraltar translated it into English, and it was published in the London Philatelist. Now, there's just 3 copies of this stamp, 2 are in private hands, one was in my hands when I was at the British Library, so I took a particular interest in this. But what the researcher had not done, and it's a good lesson and a useful example, is he had not realised that the late Norman Williams had written up about the stamp, one in a magazine called Stamps, which is no longer appearing under that title in the UK, and then he put it into his Encyclopedia of Rare and Famous Stamps, essentially the same text, where he describes the fact that the 3rd copy, where it had come from, given its provenance, which the Spanish authors had slightly misunderstood, and the fact that, in fact, it was a used stamp that had been somehow cleaned. Some of that cleaning is speculation, but speculation, as long as you call it speculation, is perfectly proper, because what else have you got to go on? So I saw this article in the London Philatelist and really enjoyed it. I learnt a lot from it. Thought this is sound work, except for the original author had somehow or other failed to find what Norman Williams had published later on. Now, it's not surprising because most of the research work into Spanish philately was going to be taking place in Spain. And Norman's book was published in Switzerland by David Feldman, and it's in English. So it's not surprising that he missed it, but it is the encyclopedia of all the great rarities. So it is, in my view, one of the key works in philately. If that's the sort of area that interests you, you really ought to be looking at. Now, that's not a criticism. that's a mistake. It's not a mistake, it's a fact of life that anyone could make. I could make that. Anyone in this room could make it. How am I doing on time? Okay, right. I think I've covered most of the points. References. Yes, if you're giving references, do give proper references. There's two ways of doing it. There's the way I use, which is the humanities way of doing it, which is rather old-fashioned. And there's the modern way where you put the date of publication after the author's name. It doesn't matter which. The key thing is that it works in context of the article. In other words, you can see a statement, can say it's got a number or a name, and you can look in the references, and that proves how they knew it or where their evidence came from. That's absolutely essential, but you need to include all of the information. You need the author, the title, is it a periodical, the name of the periodical, you need to give the volume number, you need to give page number if it's put together properly, and the date of publication. Date of publication is important because you can see where it lies in the research timeline for everything. Now, I did actually fall very foul of the Smithsonian some years ago because I was privileged enough to give the keynote speech at the Institute of Analytical Philately's opening conference. And it was easy to do, but not easy to do in as much as no one had ever spoken about this to any extent before. So I thought, well, I'm not a scientist. Physics was my worst subject at school, so I can't talk about science, but I can talk about the principle of what it all means. And so what I was doing was actually giving original thought. There was no references for my original thought, so I submitted a manuscript via the organiser to the Smithsonian Scholarly Press, and they rejected it. They said, there's no references. And I felt a bit sort of, I said, well, I can't reference myself, that's cheating. So I had to add some text in and reference it to get it accepted. So that's the only exception, but it was a very interesting lesson to me. What else haven't I mentioned from my notes? Let me just have a quick look. I think I've covered just about everything, and I think with that I'll shut up and answer or attempt to answer some questions.
One moment, I'll bring you the microphone.
Who was that again? Sorry. Thank you.
David, you mentioned that it is essential to research the literature, and you've mentioned various publications, indexes where we can do that. Can you make it easy for us and actually print out, do something, or have you already done it, which just sets out some of the very basic bits of literature that we can read to make sure that we do the proper research?
It's published in the handout.
Thank you. Thank you.
Which has now been published in German and French by virtue of the kindness of the European Academy of Philately. But that's just the bare bones. I think the golden rule in any research, certainly during my years at British Library, and I always made a point of talking to people as a proactive case. A new researcher and I spend half an hour talking to them. So don't distrust the curator who will keep your project quiet. Don't distrust the librarian. Go and talk to them, see what they have to say. Talk to people who are in the area that you trust, and they'll try and open it up. But it really does come back to people, in whatever they write, writing a bibliography to help you along your way.
There's a question over here.
Yeah. You nicely described how you do the research, how you organize the bits and pieces before publishing an article. Much appreciated and agreed that in your case it's on paper. However, nowadays we possibly find online resources where it's hard to make the notes in paper, and also researchers tend to look for solutions to possibly in a digital manner or with support of the computer organize such a file. Have you ever looked in, and any recommendation? Is it still paper is best, or do you see a path to the younger people who dislike paper notes? And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
I believe that everything on paper will last longer than the digital. I remember giving a talk at the Royal some years ago about research, and someone from the audience, quite a well-known person, said, well, printed book's dead, you just publish it online. To which my reply was, well, really, with something that's published on a website, it will disappear the moment that someone decides they're going to take it down. Unless it's been archived, it will disappear. So you've got to be very careful. And as long as you have a printed book on good quality paper, then that's safe. I think one's got to be careful about the explosion of websites and printed books because of computer. In the work might be shoddy. And one always rather laughs at, and one shouldn't because I think it's generally sound, at Wikipedia. And you can look at all sorts of websites about things. So if I'm doing a project on a particular subject, I'll put in all the keywords and see what Google, whoever, brings up. And I see that really as, it depends on the subject and when the subject occurred that you're writing about. But you really ought to look at the printed things first and then see what other people have said. But it's just too easy for people to publish and get it wrong. But I'm a great believer in using the computer. I mean, you cut and paste and put it in your notes and say, well, okay, so-and-so has said so-and-so, we access that website or that digital resource on a particular date. And then you might decide, I'm not too sure about that, I need to check it. So I would flag it up in yellow and say, needs some checking. But yes, increasingly that must be right. But as with everything, it's a question of how accurate is the information you're getting to.
David,
So,
you've made great play of and said quite a lot about how important it is to rely on literature. How do you know at the end of the day whether what's put in the literature is right? Isn't it important to go back one stage further to the original research and archives to establish whether what's been written later is something that stands up?
absolutely essential. If an archive exists, then you can be pretty sure, if it's been kept properly, that information will be definitive. You have to read it chronologically, you have to read it carefully, you have to understand the language of the time. For example, British postal notices don't talk about postal rates, they talk about duty rates, which derives from the taxation element of all of this. So you have to understand that as well. And you have to look at the original covers and people's collections, which I cover in my paper. But people put all sorts of interpretations on things. I mean, one of the common things is that people will make it up. They won't think about, and usually they make up convoluted answers to quite forward questions. I mean, especially with postal rates, you know, this rate is 2 cents or tuppence more than it should be, and people will say, well, there must have been another rate. Well, was there? Was it just they didn't have any stamps and they overpaid it deliberately? I mean, we've all seen that, but people have gone around making it up. So you mustn't lose sight of the fact that a cover, say, is overpaid. You've got to say, well, we need to explore that. And the answer is probably in the archive, if the archive still exists. But there is quite a lot of resistance to using archives. Now, there's a book been published, I'll mention the subject, but I won't mention the authors. But on the mail that left Constantinople and was headed for the rest of Europe. And this was this is the Orient Express mail. And when I was with Harmer's in the 1970s, no one really understood these covers in Britain. I think they understood them more in continental Europe. And everyone didn't really understand or know how to interpret them or take them. And then someone started writing about it in Germany, I think originally, probably in the 70s or 80s. More recently this has occurred. But you see, to me, I would think, well, this is an international postal arrangement. Mail was going to Germany, France, Austria, Britain, all these places. There must be things in the archives of all of those countries that relates to how this operated. But I don't know that anyone has been to the archives, if they still exist, in all those countries. And to the people who've been researching this recently, I said, well, I don't know the addresses or speak the languages concerned, but I've certainly been into the British Postal Archives, seen that there is a file on this subject of the right date. And until such time as that file has been looked at and either discarded because it's not what it's described as, or it's valued, then the research isn't complete. So your point is absolutely right. You've got to be careful about its interpretation.
Thank you.
David, I think I'm the next one, yes. Thank you for once again sharing, as you always do, such wisdom, great wisdom. Could I make a couple of comments? And I say this, I spent a working lifetime in academia churning out papers. One of the things I always stressed to students when they were setting out to write a paper is to ask themselves, and then very often to write at the top of the paper in the opening, why I am writing this paper. Why does it matter? We all know in our own areas an almost infinite amount of facts. I think if you ask yourself the question, what is the purpose of this paper? You talked about writing the history of an auction house. I think it does two things. One, it may be you're writing it because nobody has previously given a sustained study of this. Another common motivation is that my research has revealed more information than others. And that, of course, brings you to including the references, because in the end, we're all pygmies standing on giants' shoulders. Those who've gone before have done far more than we ever will. And that, in a sense, brings me to a short second point. I received at Christmas a copy of a book on colonialism, and some which received quite a lot of critical comment. It is one of the laziest pieces of writing by an academic from a respectable one, well, once respectable university. And over and over again, when you look at the reference at the foot of the page, for example, there will be a quote from a newspaper from 1900. You find that the reference at the bottom of the page says that this quote from the newspaper comes from an article published in 2005. That is the reference. The author has not taken the trouble to go back to the original source. And this seems, I mean, I would, I have worked over the years as a voluntary referee. I would certainly want that changed in the paper to show that the writer of the paper has been back to the primary source. Otherwise, you don't know what the secondary source, what that author has omitted, possibly because they are grinding a particular axe, which may or may not be justified. And there seems to me, and Wikipedia also leads us down the same road, it is a terrible temptation to use secondary sources rather than going back to the original and seeing it, right or wrong, but seeing it in its totality. And it seems to me that there is no alternative to doing that. And very often over the years I found going back to that original has revealed things that I had not otherwise seen. Indeed, we all know from writing anything, even just writing up our own stamp collections, when that process of writing brings into your head questions and you see things that you haven't previously seen. But we live in a, I think, really quite a dangerous situation because of the computer, that we are increasingly using secondary, even tertiary sources, and your stressing of the importance of bibliographies and printed ones and so on is very important in my view, that we do have to get back to the original.
We are agreed. In the work I'm doing, it's going to take a long time, about Shanahan stamp auctions, if you look at the context of what was going on, you realise that this was a national event, 1950s Ireland, that's never been written up properly. There's one book written by a journalist who makes some strange remarks and doesn't give a timeline or anything, I guess. But also, it was brought home to me that this is actually a national question, because questions on that particular issue were asked in the Dáil, in the judiciary, made legal history. And then about 5 years ago, when I lived in London, there was a lovely man from Ireland who was staying in one of the flats in my block of flats for 6 months while he was doing a job in London. And like all Irish people, he was a delight to talk to, and we chatted away about lives and everything. And I said, stamps, and he said, Shanahan's auctions. And I said, oh, you know about Shanahan's auction? All Ireland knows about Shanahan's auction. And the bigger story was that he had an aunt who in the 1950s borrowed $1,000 from an American relative to invest in Shanahan stamp auctions and lost it all. And it left a big memory in Irish society. So when I come to write about it, why am I writing this bit has got to do with what happened philatelically, happened morally and ethically, what it meant in Ireland to the nation. And I think that wider context of application of philately is enormously important, and one that I'd like to see developed. So once again, we are agreed, and I'm not surprised.
I was actually only say yes. The other one? Does that work? Yeah, I was only going to say what Roger said more eloquently and at length. It was, it doesn't really matter whether it's a printed volume or a digital volume. You've still got to go back and find out where did they get their stuff from. And the number of times I've gone back to archival sources to find there was either much more that needed to be said or that it had been misinterpreted. And that's to do with Second World War postmarks even. So the is it going digital, is it being paper, is actually a bit of a red herring. And you've got to go back to the beginning. Are there any other questions to come? And we'll take that one. We'll do a thank you to David. We need Alex Hyman. And Alex is here. So we're all met, and so if we could follow that routine, I'd be grateful.
Okay. One more on the relation between articles written being in journals and exhibiting. There has been slightly mentioned, I like much that you mandate to put things into context. In my experience, sometimes exhibitors try to do the same in their exhibits, for example, showing a map of lesser known places. However, typically, most juries tell them off and tell them, if you put a map, that's just spoiling the space you have got, you shouldn't do these pieces. Or also judges keep telling exhibitors, do not try to make an article out of your exhibit. The viewer should know. So I see people who are somewhere in between, showing my knowledge, maybe via my exhibit, are told not to do. However, they might be a nice source of knowledge to go into an article, but I guess many do not see the borderline between the rules to use for an exhibit and the rules for the articles.
I think the answer to that is there are two lots of rules. One is the FIP rules and the other is the rule of truth and context. In the handout, well, let me tell you the story very briefly. Lots of you know Bill Headley, and there's one other friend of ours, and we're all philatelists. We go out for a walk once a month, somewhere in the southeast of England. And all being philatelists, we discuss philately and politics and all sorts of things that never should be repeated. But the thing that really has come to the fore over the last 3 or 4 years has been context philately. And we've been discussing this, and it was in January that we were sitting in the pub, and we came up with the name context philately. And this is the difference between exhibiting, which can be restricting in telling the story for the receiver, and telling a rounded story that needs to be told in a particular way for a particular audience. And there is the difference. And so to some extent, organised competitive philately is restricting to truth, whereas the article or the book has got better free rein. The use of maps, I think, is absolutely fundamental to setting the scene anywhere. And even to the extent that my sister, who still works at the British Library, works in the map library. So talk to me about maps of any period you like.
I think there's been enough said in questions to indicate our thanks to David. And as he said, his comments this morning are based on an article, and that article is circulated to all of you. So take the handout away with you, read, mark, and inwardly digest, and if you've got any questions, ask David, but on another day, because we've run out of time.
I'm seeking to improve upon the article with another version. It must be kept up to date, so I'm very interested in comment suggestions.
There's an open invitation there. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, of course, that we don't really want to discuss exhibiting here because it belongs for another 2-day seminar somewhere else. Because, you know, I often say to people who say about the judges didn't understand my exhibit, or they told me to do X, they told me to do Y, and my answer always is, if you don't like what the judge says, go and find another judge. Because they're all different. So what I have next, David, thank you so much. I'm truly grateful, and I think people found that fascinating, informative, interesting, and helpful. So. And now I'd like to introduce, if it needs introduction again, our good friend Alex Hyman, who has spent the last, what feels like 15 years, labouring away to create the first context philately exhibition that's been put on, I think, anywhere.
Certainly at the Royal.
Certainly at the Royal. There we go. So, Alex, please, you've got 5 minutes.
Okay, yeah. All right, hello, everyone. I'm between you and lunch, and I recognize that, so I'm going to be brief, but I want to focus on what you may, after you have some lunch, are going to enjoy. And I've been waiting several years to stand right here for these 5 minutes to describe to you an incredible connection that we've discovered between what you will see upstairs, which is a context and history of the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. And some of you are going, what's the Zulu War? Some of you are going, oh yeah, I remember that thing, or I've heard about that. But the real question is, why is it here at the Royal? Why should it be here at the Royal? And the group in this room right now is more related to the importance of the Zulu War and its connection to the Royal than any other audience that we will be in front of between now and the end of the exhibition on July 31. So here we go. In 1897, one of the most famous participants of the war, a gentleman and officer named John Chard, he was the senior commander at the Battle of Rorke's Drift. He is played by Stanley Baker in the movie Zulu. He would receive the Victoria Cross for his actions at that battle between the 22nd and 23rd of January, 1879. There is a large diorama upstairs. There are artifacts related to that particular battle, as there are with many other aspects of the conflict. He died of cancer at the end of 1897. And as a relatively young man, he was 50 years old. His family sold some parts of his estate and they kept other parts. And one of the things they decided to sell, I guess there were no descendants that were immediately interested in the philatelic aspects of his estate, they sold his stamp collection in a general auction as a single lot. Sitting at that auction in early 1898 was a gentleman, the Earl of Crawford. Where did the Earl of Crawford's philatelic journey begin? It began at that auction. And he looked in through the catalog, noticed that it was ex-John Chard VC, probably one of the most important celebrity, political, military figures of that time. A man like the Earl of Crawford, and everyone in his station would have known John Chard, that name, like it was the way we would know the most famous person in the world. Elton John or Arnold Schwarzenegger or I can't even think of, or Douglas MacArthur. I mean, really, it would have been that level of engagement. And he goes, oh, that's interesting, and he buys it. And over the next 15 years, the Earl of Crawford would change the face of worldwide philately. We would not be here today. The Royal could be dramatically different. The British Library would certainly be dramatically different. The way in which all of worldwide philatelic literature is understood today would be drastically different. If John Chard had not done what he had done in the Zulu War, if he had not received the Victoria Cross, and if his family had not sold his stamp collection, the Earl of Crawford may never have gotten involved in philately. And I remind you that the Crawford's focus up through 1913, right on the eve of World War I, meant that all that he gathered, which then ended up here in England, was saved the devastation throughout all of Europe of World War I and World War II. So consider how different, especially our early philatelic literature research and knowledge would be if not for that. So that is why, I mean, as soon as I found that connection many years ago, I just was like enamored. I was like, finally, I have a great connection. And then when this, the Crawford Festival came up, it's year 2 or year 3? Year 2. So this connection I was aware of several years ago, and then the Crawford Festival was designed and put on, and it became obvious that the first major audience that needed to have a special preview of this exhibition, Clash of Empires, was you. Because you're here for the reason that the Royal is the most connected to why this history matters. And again, history matters to every connecting part of what we do. But in particular, I assure you that Earl of Crawford is so important, and you are the one audience I don't have to convince of that. But very much what we have upstairs and connected to John Chard, we have some of the most remarkable items from his family that have never been put on public exhibition before, 2 letters sent by him during the campaign, a Bible given to him, as well as other defenders at the Battle of Rorke's Drift, a Masonic scroll that was given to him by his lodge, which you'll see it's one of the most dramatic hand-illustrated objects up there. There are over 500 artifacts on display covering the vast range of how you can tell a story side by side with postal and philatelic artifacts from uniforms and shields. You'll see it all in a moment. It is still 2% to go until it is fully ready. It opens to the public on July 1. So this week is very much a preview week, so sort of mind our dust a little bit up there, but I'm very excited for all of you to be able to come up and see it. We're still working on a few banners and some pieces, but it really has been a tremendous privilege to put this on. I've already received the question, so I'll be very clear. The collection that you will see up there is my collection. There is one item. It's the last shield that belongs to my co-curator. It was given to him by the then Zulu king 4 years ago. pretty cool thing to have in there. But it is the combination of what context philately can be and should be. I will only just reinforce what David was saying in his talk and say that if you are interested in this concept of looking at context and philately, July 12th, we're having a symposium that starts on the 12th and goes to the 15th, but that day is focused on context philately. And if you're interested in coming, please let us know and we'll let you know how to reserve a spot. 31 speakers coming from around the world across those 4 days, and so we'd love to have you. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Alex. We've got the context. We'd like the references now, please.
The pencils, which Nicola and I were talking about, what's the best thing to give to the participants here? And the answer is the pencils that arrived 1 hour ago. That's how under the wire we are. But since you're all book people, it can't be pens. So we have pencils for you. They're as a gift to all of you. It'll be upstairs.
You have no. It must be an American thing. You have no idea how last minute this has been. But I have to say, I have not known anybody put on a presentation at the Royal over so long with so much enthusiasm and so much application as Alex, and I'm hugely grateful for what he's going to show us. And we can come up and see it now, can we? You can see it before lunch, during lunch. It's going to be on for today and tomorrow. So I'll give you the health and safety. Sorry? I was going to do that. God, and you wonder why I'm giving up, you know. This, so it's open upstairs. The health and safety warning is if you trip over or you break an ankle on a frame that's not put together properly, it's not our fault, right? So this is a work in progress, which opens on the 1st, but we wanted very much to have this audience have the opportunity to have a look at what we're trying to do, which is a new departure for the Royal, which is upstairs, 1 floor above. Lunch is on the 4th floor, where we started this morning. So we're reconvening here at 2:15. We'll make that 2:20. I think we can live with that. So if you could be back here, say 2:20. Lunch, Clash of Empires. If you haven't given me your form or your dinner money, can you do that now?